Welcome to this Rattle and Hum Sports Podcast. I'm Bryan Houston, and with us today is certified nutritionist, health advisor, pharmacy technician, and writer Mika Bradford. Mika, how you doing?
Great, Bryan. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you very much for talking to us. Unfortunately, we're going to be talking about a pretty horrific topic. On Monday, April the 15th, of course, the Boston Marathon took place, and it went from a scene of sheer joy and accomplishment and celebration to instant horror with the explosion of a couple of bombs that ended up killing 3 people at the time of this podcast and injuring hundreds of others. Some pretty horrific injuries, including loss of legs, loss of feet, things like that. First of all, I just want to get your initial reaction to what went down yesterday.
You know, Bryan, it was devastating. I work in the context within a very, very large pharmacy in Dallas that we've been compounding for years. And so we are one of the first locations when there's a crisis or if a facility is in need of a specific medication that they come to. And so watching this situation unfold, I could just feel in my gut just how unsettling it must be for all of those first responders. And at the same time, what a blessing it was that if it had to happen, that because of the nature of running and some of the symptoms that can happen after a runner has ran the distance, like the Boston Marathon, having that many medical professionals on hand was saving grace for many people, even with the level and extent of injury that they had. But it was devastating. I mean, we immediately were looking at what the New York Times was releasing as far as information. But it hit home because we've also been very involved in marathons here throughout Texas, whether it's, the Dallas Marathon or what used to be the White Rock Marathon to support Scottish Rite Children's Hospital, or even some of the smaller marathons or half marathons like the Rock and Roll. And so leg health and circulation is something that we've promoted for years. And so to see how devastating that could be to the runners, but then so many of the bystanders was pretty tough.
Well, obviously, this podcast is not going to deal with the subject of terrorism. That's for another time and place. But I would like to talk to you from a health standpoint about, first of all, the people who were injured in this situation and what they're facing, specifically those who are critically injured, maybe lost a leg or a foot or some kind of a limb in the explosion, and what they're going to be facing.
And again, I always like to share, I am not a doctor, but from a nutritional standpoint, when we're injured, we have to have the nutrients to be able to produce new cells, to be able to recover optimally. It's just like a machine. You've got to have the guts to make it run. And when you look at some of the injuries that these individuals sustained, the first thing that I thought of was the things that can play a role in their recovery process are factors like, are there any predispositions or preconditions that we're dealing with ahead of time? What medications are they taking? Are they taking any, vitamins? Because when you look, you have to have a lot of antioxidants just for regular body functioning. And when we're talking about creating these cells, we're talking about wound repair and the body's ability to combat inflammation, then that demand is going to increase. And that's just looking at healing, not even at the possibility of having to stave off or fight off an offending agent like a bacterial infection. So there's going to be definitely a long road ahead of many of these individuals when you look at the nutritional supports that they're going to need, also the physiological supports, and then how this could predispose them for some other health complications down the road.
I was just looking at a story. The USA Today reported that one of the men who was injured was a young man, a 27-year-old man, who was there to watch his girlfriend run and had both his legs amputated in the bombing. And apparently the injury did extensive vascular and bone damage to this young man. So he's got a lot to deal with.
Yeah, and one of the things, too, that happens is for any individual, regardless of how an amputation has occurred or what's prompted the condition, whether it was by traumatic injury or if it was through surgical procedure due to infection or gangrene, but what you have to look at is that's going to radically impact the level of activity that individual participates in. And so then we're going to be coming and dealing with more of a sedentary lifestyle for some individuals. You know, even the healing process alone and getting to the point of being fitted for prosthetics and having the tools to be more mobile takes time. And so some of the things that people have to look at is when you have decreased energy expenditure, just because of wound healing, and once you get past that point, then looking at food choices, because there are some abstracts and studies that have looked at the fact of is there possibly the increase for cardiovascular issues because of either if there's diets not being watched or high fatty diets, and then the level of activity has decreased, and so we have an increase in weight gain and body mass index. So there are definitely some things that people have to be mindful of once, of course, they've gotten past the initial, shock and trauma and have dealt with some of the most obvious life changes.
We also talked a little bit before we started the podcast where some of these folks are going to be dealing with probably having to get prosthetics, and you mentioned the issue of phantom pain. Talk a little bit about that.
You know what's interesting, the world of nutrition, and this is kind of more going out with the physicians that provide more complementary or functional medicine. There's been a growing awareness and even a couple studies that have been done looking at acupuncture and it being placed and utilized in the remaining limb, and over a process and series of treatments helping to diminish or discontinue the phantom pain. And phantom pain is typically characterized where it feels like there's still pain where the limb once resided, but is no longer there. And so it's exciting to see how some of the functional medicine approaches and complementary medicine are being used to support amputees, needs and for things that we wouldn't necessarily think about. Another thing, too, is that when you look at any amputation and with wound healing, now many of the main hospitals, we're talking about treatment facilities, even here in Dallas, have hyperbaric oxygen chambers, and depending on the extent of how long it's lasted for a wound to heal, then they're utilizing that technology because of helping to increase the oxygen saturation to the tissue. Some things that have also come about looking at the colloidal silver. We have a limb salvage facility, and a limb salvage facility is a group or a practitioner where they try to utilize every means possible within reason to save a limb that maybe has been mangled in an extreme incident or accident. But even using something that years ago was thought to be more of a health food store or a wives' tale type product, but the colloidal silver, which also is some of the technology that's used, like in the Under Armour products when we talk about decreasing odor and bacterial growth. So it's kind of neat to see how some of these nutritional supports help health, but then also now are being incorporated into like the Under Armour garments, compression socks, sports compression socks wear to help with decreasing microbial growth. So we've got some neat things that are making full circle.
Also, there is the issue of the emotional trauma to not only those who were injured, but just to the people who were there on the scene, and how they're going to cope with that long term, having gone through something so traumatic. Especially, and I ran the Houston Marathon years ago, and I can recall from my own experience. My son was 4 years old, and my wife and my son would go to different checkpoints along the race route. And my little boy was 4, and he was waving signs and showing his support. And there are thousands of volunteers there who are pulling for you and encouraging you. And it's the only sporting event that I can think of where there are no bad guys. There's nobody to root against. So you've got this euphoria, the endorphins are kicking in, everybody's in just this festive mood, and then in the snap of fingers, it turned into this horrible tragedy and this cowardly act that just completely shatters that feeling. How are people going to cope with something like that?
I encourage people that, especially if we're talking something where you're looking at a post-traumatic situation, to definitely look for clinical support and get some guidance, whether that be just being able to talk it out and work through it. And then from a chemical standpoint, depending on that person's current state of health, I mean, of course, there are different medications and antidepressants, but when you look from a holistic standpoint, if there's not a concern for somebody being on multiple medications, and some of the things that can be used over the counter just to support the muscular nervous system. Because that's one thing, when anxiety sets in, just like in a car wreck, what's the first thing that happens if you see it coming? You clench up. The muscles just go into hunker down mode. And so looking at, of course, getting clinical assessment and working with practitioners, but things like magnesium. We have many individuals that have different health conditions that one of the facets is muscle tension or hypertension as well. And so increased magnesium helps because magnesium is the mineral that's responsible for muscle relaxation. We have many individuals, and I have many doctors that have their patients utilizing or looking at nutritionally supporting their daily routine and diet with 5-HTP to help support the precursors that support the production of serotonin. So emotionally, I think that when somebody's gone through this, you have to look at the entire picture. You have to look at the physical well-being, the mental well-being, nutritionally, what's happening. And then it's just so important in times like this to really have a good team, a good healthcare team that's looking at the whole person, because this isn't something that goes away overnight. And one of the things, too, when you look at products, I mean, there's so many items now, and kind of digressing, even with the issue of infections and things, and now some of our mainstream companies, like Johnson I think Kimberly-Clark, they've now come out with different ointments with the colloidal silver. I mean, we're seeing more companies be progressive in their thinking, as well as more practitioners, and that's a plus for anyone these days that's had a traumatic event happen, that we can look at the whole person.
Okay, Mika, as we get ready to wrap this up, any other things I've left out that you want to cover before we wrap it up for this afternoon?
I just think it's so important that once the families are able to adjust and get past this horrific incidents, that they're able to be strong and to really focus on. I mean, nutrition can be what absolutely is the catalyst to helping them get back on the road to health and recovery. And many times when we've gone through something devastating, it's human nature for us to shut down and to kind of not want to overthink things. And nutrition and health is definitely something that we have to think about. We have to make a concerted effort with. And so I just would encourage anyone, that if they've struggled, whether it's from the situation with the Boston Marathon, or if they've had an event in their life that's caused something traumatic, an injury, to definitely visit and look back at what are some things they could do, because the smallest changes can sometimes yield the greatest outcome and benefit.
Great advice. Mika Bradford, thanks very much for coming on with us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it, and just our prayers are with all the families in Boston and from around the country that participated.
Well said. Mika Bradford, the certified nutritionist, health advisor, pharmacy technician, and writer for Rattle and Hump Sports. I'm Bryan Houston. Thank you for listening to this podcast on Rattle and Hump Sports.